Are all DACs audibly transparent? Can you hear a difference between two DACs that both have well over 100 dB sign-out? Well, that question is actually quite a heated debate in the audio community. There are a lot of people that feel that source gear, DACs and amps is just as or maybe even more important than the headphones or speakers you're using, and there are a lot of other people who feel that it makes no difference whatsoever and buying anything more than an Apple dongle is a complete waste of money. Well, in this video we're going to do some testing and see if we can get a conclusive answer to that question. There's already a lot of different studies and papers looking into the audibility thresholds for various individual factors such as distortion, jitter, high-res audio, but how do we actually tell, plain and simple, whether two devices are audibly distinguishable from one another? The simple way to get an answer is to do a properly controlled blind ABX test. You set it up so that you have no idea and no way to tell which device is playing other than the sound itself. You can listen to device A or device B and mystery device X, and you have to try and identify whether device X is actually device A or device B. If you can do that correctly and consistently, that shows that there is likely an audible difference between the two. And you might say, okay, well, there's loads of examples of blind tests on YouTube and people that say that they've done things like this on Headphone, for example, so why are we still talking about it? Well, the big problem is almost all of these, every single one that I found when researching for this video, is problematic and inconclusive, and we'll talk about why with a few examples. And then once we've discussed some of the common problems and challenges with blind tests, I'd like to conduct a test of my own that is as tightly controlled as possible and hopefully gives a conclusive answer to the question, can well-measuring DACs sound different? This video is going to be quite long just because it needs to be thorough. If you would like to skip straight to the results, you can go to this timestamp, but I would strongly recommend you watch the full video because not only does it show why the tests that I've done have been done in the way that they've been done, but also explains why some of what you see and read online on both sides of this debate might not be as conclusive as it seems. Let's start with the basics. Why do we need blind tests in the first place? Why can't we just listen to two things and see if we hear a difference? Well, we are human, we are flawed, and we have biases, and it doesn't matter what your profession is, your age, how good your hearing is, how experienced you are, however you wish to quantify that, there is no way to escape this problem. You can listen to two different devices and hear a difference, not because a difference actually exists, but because your brain is tricking you. Someone told you that something has a particular characteristic, or it's more expensive, or looks more impressive. Those things might mean that you expect it to sound better and therefore are more likely to hear it as sounding better, even if in reality it is exactly the same as something else. You're not lying about hearing this difference. You are genuinely hearing a difference, it's just that it's not actually there. It's your brain tricking you. And if you were to remove any knowledge of which device you were listening to, do it completely blind, you might find that suddenly you're not able to reliably pick out the differences anymore or even identify which device is which because that difference in sound might not have actually been there. Placebo is an incredibly powerful effect that none of us are immune to, and that's exactly why in the medical industry, for example, trials for new medicines have to be done with placebo control groups because otherwise people can report or in some cases genuinely experience symptoms that either weren't real or were real but maybe were caused by something else. So, haven't people already done this before? Aren't there countless examples of people on YouTube and Headphone and the Headphones.com forum of people doing blind tests and showing that everything from DACs to cables to network switches make a difference? And if so, why are we still arguing about it? Well, yes, there are countless examples, but as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, I wasn't actually able to find a single one that claimed a positive result at least, that was properly controlled. So this first video was put out by Alpha Audio. There is a link to it in the description, and it is on the subject of network switches. The listeners sit down and they listen to a streaming setup, swapping between a number of network switches, and report the differences that they hear. But the problem with this one is that despite what the title says, it's not actually a blind test. The listeners don't know what they're listening to. They are blind, but there is no actual test involved, no check to see whether they can correctly identify which device is which, and the differences that they are reporting, there's no verification to see whether those are able to be consistently identified. So here in this blind listening session, as it would probably be more appropriate to call it, they could in theory say anything they like about any of the units, and there would be no way to verify whether that is a genuine audible difference or not. So there's no ABXing going on. They might not know what they are listening to, but there is no verification. So this is not really a blind test, this is more just a blind listening session. Let's look at one where someone did do an actual blind A/B test. This second video was done by Jay-Z, Argy, and Danny from GR Research, and it's on the subject of speaker cables. For the test, they had Danny sit down, they covered the setup so that Danny couldn't see the gear, and they had Danny guess for 10 songs whether each one was playing through his own speaker cables or through a pair of generic cables, with Jay swapping them randomly each round. And Danny got 8 out of 10 correct, so why isn't this test valid? Well, for a blind test to be conclusive, you have to make 100% certain that the only possible factor, the only possible way that you could determine which was being used is the thing that you are testing for. In this case, the sound quality of the cables themselves. The big issue is that Danny is in the room the whole time, so even when nothing is playing, the time that it takes for Jay to swap or not swap the cables, the sound of the different connectors and cables plugging into or unplugging from the speakers, the sound of the different cables, which are quite different. One of them was much thicker than the other, rustling over the carpet, for instance. Just the way that Jay moves when he's handling the cables could all be potential tells that could indicate which cable is being used, even when nothing is playing. And there was actually a small possibility that Danny may have been able to catch a small glimpse between the speaker and the set of gear itself, as there was a small gap. So unfortunately, there are a lot of potential tells that could have given some kind of indication, and as a result, we can't actually be certain that the reason Danny got 8 out of 10 was because he could hear a difference between the cables rather than something else. And I just want to be 100% clear, this is not me making any sort of accusation of deception in the slightest. The point here is that if there are any possible tells, even if it is subconsciously affecting your decision, it is still a factor. For a blind test to be conclusive, you have to control for and make sure that there are no other possible tells. Unfortunately, pretty thorough isn't thorough enough. There are either issues or there aren't. But even if the test was properly controlled, 8 out of 10 might sound like quite a bit, but actually isn't considered statistically significant. There's about a 6% chance to get 8 out of 10 just through pure luck, just through guessing. When you do a blind test, the more runs that you do, the more statistically significant a result you can get. So 8 out of 10 correct would be about a 6% chance of just getting that by pure luck. 16 out of 20 correct would be about a 0.6% chance of just being luck. So much more statistically significant, much more likely that that result shows there is a definite audible difference. There is something which allows you to tell what you are listening to. So you have to do sufficient runs, else you'll have to get basically every single one right, or your result won't be statistically significant. If you can get it right 80 or even 60% of the time, if you do enough runs, you can show that there is an audible indicator there. But if you only do 10 runs, unless you get 9 or 10 out of 10 right, the result is not significant. So do 15 or 20 runs and you can get a much more significant result, even if you do still only get 80% of them right. Doing a proper blind test with all the proper controls for the right length of time is really hard, and with certain things it's almost impossible to control for all the possible factors. So with a DAC, how do we go about designing a test that does not have these problems? This is actually the third time that I filmed this video. We've redone it a few times to address even some quite minor concerns and issues, because I want this to be as thorough and conclusive as possible in answering the question, can well-measuring DACs sound different? Particularly the ones that are commonly claimed as being audibly transparent, and therefore you should not be able to hear a difference between any of them, but still have quite a lot of people saying that they do sound different. Now, how much of a difference this makes or whether it's worth it is up to you. That is not the point of this video. For transparency, I've said before that I am an advocate for getting good DACs and good amps, but I also feel that you should spend the vast majority of your budget on the headphones or speakers. Those do make a much bigger difference, but regardless, I'd like to show that there is nonetheless with DACs a difference. So for our test to be conclusive, we have to make sure that firstly there are sufficient runs in the ABX test to have the potential to be statistically significant. So we'll probably do 20 runs. Secondly, we need to make sure that what we are testing actually falls within the bounds of what's assumed to be audibly transparent. There are obviously edge cases where general rules don't apply, or obviously broken products which are probably going to sound different to almost anyone. That's not what we're looking to test. And thirdly, we need to make sure that there are no tells, that everything has been properly controlled and nothing other than the sound itself allows me to identify which is which. Now, I actually have this. This is a blind ABX testing device, and it's something which I use regularly to ABX DACs and amps when I'm reviewing stuff. The way that it works is you hook it up to two different devices, do some measurements and level matching, because remember, we're looking to see if we can hear a difference in the sound of the two devices, not just whether one DAC has a higher output level or not. And actually, on that note, Amplifiers, you have to be really careful when level matching and kind of need to use software matching in your player, because volume matching close enough to be conclusive with a potentiometer is basically impossible. And then you tell it how many runs you want to do. You can swap between input A and input B and mystery input X. Each time you select an input, this bank of relays disconnects the signal. This big bank of relays goes through a truly random switching sequence so that it's not possible for you to hear if it has or hasn't switched, or which way it's switched. That's important because otherwise the sound of the relays themselves could be a tell. You could just hear whether it's switched over or not, and then it reconnects the output. The reason that it's important to disconnect the output fully rather than just switching or not switching is because otherwise you could probably hear a click when it did switch from device A to device B and no click when it stayed on the same device. So fully disconnecting the output, switching, then closing it again means that it eliminates that as a potential tell. This device means assuming you are properly level matched, you can ABX with no way to tell what you're listening to besides the actual sound itself. But here's the problem. I can sit and do a perfectly controlled blind ABX test with this, get a great result, and you can watch it and go, I don't believe you. That is completely fair. The problem with this is that even if everything is genuinely properly controlled and legitimate, you are still relying on the fact that I am telling the truth. And so we need to add one more criteria to this test, which is that it has to be remotely verifiable and inspectable by you. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a specific part of a DAC, the upsampling filter, something you may have seen if you've dived into the settings of your own DACs before, and something that some high-end DACs from the likes of Ferrum and Chord make a point out of using better ones. High-res audio and high-performance reconstruction filters are something where there are clear measurable differences, but significant disagreement over whether it matters or not. There's a lot of people that feel that high-performance oversampling makes no difference and it's complete nonsense, and there are a lot of other people that are willing to pay quite hefty sums of money for hardware and software tools that do it better because they feel that it does make a nice improvement. So we're going to test it. If it does, it kills two birds with one stone because firstly it shows that high-performance oversampling does make a difference, and secondly it shows that DACs sound different because DACs use different oversampling filters. The other nice thing about doing it this way is we can do the whole test digitally using software ABX tools, and by doing this we avoid any potential physical tells or unit variation that might skew the test. You guys can poke around, analyze, and look at the files that I've used for testing to make sure that nothing unusual is going on, and you can also replicate it yourself if you'd like. So here's the test. In the description there is a link to a Google Drive folder, in which are 3 audio files. One is a snippet of the original song that I used, the original 44.1 kHz audio. One is that audio, but upsampled using HQ Player with a fairly basic filter and basic TDPF dither, very similar to what you might find in most consumer DACs. And another one that was upsampled using a much higher performance reconstruction filter and higher order noise shaper, very similar to what you might find in a Chord DAC, for example. You can download and verify for yourself, but these files are the same sample rate with no differences under 20 kHz besides the differences in dithering well below -100 dB. They are identical in level to within 0.01 dB, and they have been cut to the exact same sample to avoid a timing offset between the two. The only difference is the oversampling itself. There's also a text file with step-by-step instructions on how to recreate these files yourself so that you can confirm that the ones I'm using have not been modified in any other way, or if you'd like to replicate this test with your own track. Then I use the Foobar ABX plugin, which allows us to perform a blind ABX test and provides a results file that includes the results themselves, hashes of the files used so that you can verify the ones that I've shared in the Google Drive folder are the ones I used for the test, the device I'm outputting to, and you can then verify the entire results log at the link provided by the creator of the plugin. Myself and Blaine also did some other checks and tweaks to the test, such as recording the analog output of the DAC and making sure that there was no unexpected interaction with either file there. So we've controlled absolutely everything we possibly can to reduce it down so that the only possible factor is the sound of the two files. And of course, for good measure, in the description there is a link to the full recording of me actually doing the blind ABX test start to finish. I'm using the Hollow Audio May as the test DAC, as that's my personal favorite, with the Zale HM1 headphone amplifier and the Hyphaman Sesvara. In theory, you should be able to replicate this test on pretty much any equipment, but for the headphones, do make sure to pick something which has a meaningful amount of upper treble, like at 18 kHz. If you pick something with a more Harman-like tuning, where it rolls off the upper treble a little bit more, that will impede your ability on this test. So, how did I do? Well, I was able to choose correctly 18 out of 20 times, and there is only a 0.02% chance of being able to get that result just by pure luck. This is a very statistically significant result and shows that, yes, these two files almost certainly can be audibly distinguished. The reconstruction filter made a difference, and so the oversampling is audibly distinguishable, and any two DACs that used filters like these should be audibly distinguishable, at least to some people. But why do these sound different? Aren't they supposed to be audibly transparent? Well, originally I wasn't entirely certain myself, and Blaine and I spent a number of hours discussing things and looking for problems, and after a while he asked this question.
The differences we thought were there under 20K were just due to clock drift, and there are actually no differences below 20K.
Right.
Yeah, there's no meaningful phase delta under 20K.
No.
Okay, like, stupid question. How high can you hear?
I've not checked. Probably should have done.
I feel like we should check that.
All right, let's check that. I should know. I mean, I just kind of assumed that I couldn't because I'm 26, so I can hear 20K.
Okay, well, I mean,
I can hear a little above 20K.
How high can you hear? Is it in the band where the filters are different?
I can hear 21 if I turn it up a lot.
Oh my god. So this entire time, it's not that you have the ability to hear like a microsecond of time difference. It's that you can just hear that one has more magnitude.
I mean, that explains it. I wish we'd come to that conclusion about 3 hours ago.
So what we've discovered here is that you can hear the frequency response of something that's in the audible range you can hear.
Yes. So it turns out, and I was quite surprised to find this, I can still hear slightly above 20 kilohertz, and that's where all the differences between these oversampling filters are. So it's not entirely surprising that if you have a hearing range that extends up to 20 kilohertz or slightly past 20 kilohertz, you can hear the differences that exist around 20 kilohertz. You can hear the differences between oversampling filters. Now, I don't know if I'll still be able to in a couple years' time. Right now, I can hear to that level. I'm sure I will not be able to in probably even 2 years' time. So there's a lot of claims made around transient handling and time domain issues about upsampling, which I can't verify right now, because right now there is a fairly reasonable explanation as to why I was able to pass this test, which is that I can just hear the frequency response difference. Once I can no longer do that and self-eliminate that as a factor, I will repeat this test and see if I can still hear a difference. But for now, this is a pretty reasonable explanation. I want to reiterate though, this is not me saying that there's some massive improvement here you should spend a ton of money on, not at all. This is a very subtle difference, and it's one which if you try this test, you may find you have to practice a bit and repeat the test several times before you kind of catch on and know exactly what to look for. This is something which, especially given how high in frequency it is, most people are probably not going to be able to hear, and those that can are probably going to find that it's too small a difference for them to care about anyway. The point of this video is purely for academic interest, and again to try and conclusively answer the question, are all well-measuring DACs actually audibly transparent? To which I'm now confident to say, the answer is no, and we've shown that by being careful in how we check. This gives solid evidence that even with DACs close to 120 dB SINAD, there are still factors that can mean they are not audibly transparent. So, should this result be controversial? Well, I genuinely don't think so for two reasons. Firstly, we're not talking about something intangible here. This is not something where people say you can hear it, but you can't measure it. I personally don't really think that things like that exist. If we can hear it, we can measure it, and we can measure this. We can very easily measure the filter responses of different DACs. You don't even need an audio analyzer to do it. You can just hook up your DAC to your ADC, turn off phantom power first, and as long as it's got a decently high sample rate, you can do this yourself. There are very clear differences between different oversampling filters, but we'd previously assumed, this is the second reason, that because the differences were all at or slightly above or way out of 20 kilohertz, it was inaudible, because the human range of hearing is 20 Hz to 20 kHz. That's the general set of numbers we use, the general rule of thumb, but it's not actually a law. If we look at the literature, there are plenty of examples showing that some people can hear above 20 kHz or below 20 Hz. So it's a good reminder to check your sources and see what the supporting evidence for various claims on this and other topics might be, because Regardless of whether you agree or disagree with something, if you look into it and see what the actual evidence for that claim is, you might find you were completely right and you've got all the evidence you could possibly need to support that, you were completely wrong and now you've had your mind changed for the better, or actually no one's really sure because the existing evidence is either, well, non-existent or it does exist but doesn't agree with each other. In any case, you'll read some interesting stuff. Seriously, go and buy an AES membership. There are so many fantastic resources there, and I think anyone watching this video probably should go and get one. There's a lot of people that are very against measurements and blind testing generally, and that's kind of silly. You are ignoring a huge amount of valid and useful information, and without blind testing, you can't even be certain that what you are hearing is actually what you are hearing. And you can't use measurements to try and find products that have the sorts of behavior you like and are going to have the kind of sound that you like. But conversely, there's also quite a lot of people that often make quite assertive claims about something being absolutely factual, even if either there isn't actually evidence that supports it, or there is evidence that contradicts it. And hopefully, as more study and experimentation is conducted into various niche areas of the hobby, like oversampling, we'll get a better picture and learn more about where the thresholds of audible transparency are. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've got any questions about this test or anything said in this video or concerns about the methodology, come and say hey on our Discord server, headphones.com/discord, or the headphones.com forum. I'm GoldenSound. You're watching The Headphone Show by headphones.com. I'll see you next time.